So my task is to keep you awake now after such a very long day, but I'm glad I'm not going to be relying only on my own entertainment value, but bringing on the other panel guest, which I'd like to ask Doug McGuire, who's the coordinator of the Forest Landscape Restoration Mechanism at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, Manuel Guariwata, who's a senior principal scientist at CIFOR and also the Latin American representative of CIFOR, the Center for International Forest Research of the CGIAR, and Robin Chazdon, who I think many of you today have already met, who was a professor at Storrs and now an honorary professor at Sunshine State University. And I'm going to ask them all to give a little bit more of an overview of themselves. Before I do that, I should emphasize one thing. I've never moderated a panel discussion before. In fact, I started to look on YouTube at 11 o'clock last night to see what were the most important things of a successful panel discussion. And the first thing I realized was that the most important thing is the selection of your panel. I had no involvement in the selection of the panel. So if I was to say that I'm very pleased to see the panel because I actually know quite well Robin Chazdon, Manuel Guariwata and Doug McGuire, and they actually all know each other quite well. And then Tom, who I got to know in the last few months, I will briefly introduce myself a bit more. So I am the science domain leader in forest genetic resources and restoration at Biodiversity International. Now, Biodiversity International is a research for development organization who are part of the CGIAR, and so our principal remit is about using plant diversity to deliver sustainable development goals. And in fact, one of my main focuses is on about providing the right diversity of tree species for restoration. So it will be interesting to see how that discussion continues. Before we go on to open for the dialogue, and the main aim of this panel discussion is to open a discussion with you, I'd just like to ask, since Tom's already been introduced, Doug and Manuel and Robin to introduce themselves very briefly and just give a slight hint of some of the things, or one of the things they're most proud of in the context of what they've been doing in the context of restoration. We'll start with Robin, please.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm kind of a reformed academic. I retired from teaching at the University of Connecticut a couple of years ago to devote myself full-time to research and outreach. So my interest is in tropical forest ecology and tropical forest regeneration, and I became very interested in trying to infuse sort of the global restoration movement with an imperative to consider the importance of natural regeneration in their thinking about how to move forward and how to promote large-scale forest restoration. So in terms of what I'm most proud of, I would say it's a very long-term study that I headed up starting in 1997 in Costa Rica with secondary forests, where we were able to monitor these forests annually for 20 years now. We've terminated the project because it was just too hard to keep it going, and we just used up our funding. And believe it or not, it's not easy to get money out to continue these long-term studies. But we are still working on our data, and it's been really important, I think, in motivating a lot of people to do research with secondary forests. And now we're really finding very important results that we can use to understand better how to apply this more globally.
Manuel.
Thank you. My name is Manuel Guariwata. I'm a forest ecologist by training. I've been working in tropical forest for the last 25 years or so. I started as an academic. I did a lot of research along with Robin Chazdon, by the way, in Central America on secondary forests, and then I moved into more natural forest management, working in the Amazon. I joined CIFOR, which is a research and development organization, in 2006. And the main goal of the organization is to influence policy and practice through research, so to speak. So that's been more or less my role. I keep publishing in scientific journals, but my mission has shifted a little bit. And over the last 10 years, I've been working more towards influencing policy and practice broadly speaking, for natural forest management, integrated forest management, plantation, forestry, silviculture, everything in the tropics. And probably in the last 5 or 6 years, what has made me more proud of in terms of restoration has been the developing products that have helped to shape national policy or ways of thinking. And we launched a somewhat influential report in Colombia in 2014 that was rapidly adapted and input into the national restoration program in Colombia. We repeated that type of exercise in Mexico, and we're launching that. So over the last few years, in the context of this global movement, we've been able to change or at least identify critical gaps in terms of what is needed beyond simply tree planting, in terms of capacity building, dissemination outlets, ecoregions, those kinds of things. And the protocol is getting more and more refined, and now it's going to be applied in Ecuador. So that's pretty much I've been proud of many things I've done before, but I think in the context of this restoration movement, it's been very gratifying to see your analysis and your thought being put into practice.
Doug.
So thanks. I'm Doug McGuire. I work for the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, headquartered in Rome, Italy. I like your disclaimer, Chris. He didn't have anything to do with choosing the panel, so if we mess up, it's not his fault. But no, it's a pleasure to be here. I don't come from a research background. I think I'm probably the only person here who's not coming from a research institute or academia, but my agency works in a lot of development activities on the ground. I work in the forestry department of FAO. It's the Food and Agriculture Organization, but it defines agriculture in a broad sense. So forestry issues, crop, range, livestock, fisheries is all fair game. And I've worked for the organization for some 27 years now, so it's been a long time, and I've worked in different aspects of work in the forestry department. And more recently, since about 2011, I've been involved in the restoration movement. And what I do at FAO is I coordinate a unit that we set up a few years back to support countries, mainly to support countries in addressing the challenges, the bond challenge and the pledges that they've made to restore what are now vast areas of degraded land. I guess one of the things that I strive to do in my work, and that I guess I take some pride in, is trying to look beyond a sort of a single sector approach. And I think from those of you who've been here throughout the day today, I've heard a lot about the diversity and the wide variety of issues that we're dealing with when we talk about restoration. And so one of the big challenges we have, I think, in this whole movement is the fact that there are still very strong sectoral silos and institutions that are working within their own purview, their own mandate, and have a difficult time for a variety of reasons of sort of breaking out and seeing things from a different perspective and collaborating with people who are institutions who are representing other sectors. And that is, I think, really key if we're going to succeed in this global effort, is to try to really break down those silos and find ways to have more effective collaboration. So both inside my institution, which is a big institution, it's one of the biggest of the specialized agencies of the UN system, and we have our own silos that are very strong, but trying to see how we can interact more effectively. And outside as well, we have, I think it's been referred to a couple of times today at least, we have a global partnership on FLR, Forest and Landscape Restoration, which includes probably some 20 institutions around the world who are all focused to some extent on restoration work. And I think it's pretty clear to most of us that unless we find ways to start to work together more effectively, it's going to be business as usual, and we're going to be very limited in terms of how how much success we really have. I mean, we have a responsibility as sort of external support institutions, for the most part, I think, to help countries in what they're trying to do. And when we do that in an individualistic way and we sort of go after our own projects and we get our own funding, which is sort of the way most of our institutions work and need to work to some extent to survive, but it's very limiting in terms of what we're going to achieve in the long run. So the global partnership and other regional and global fora are striving to try to have a more effective way to work together, and we're trying to do that within FAO as well. So I think we have some evidence now that some of our more recent projects and programs that we're getting involved with in the restoration world really are built on consortia and trying to work together more effectively. So that's something that I think we need to keep pushing, you know, the envelope and making more progress, because we have so many different let's say comparative advantages when we look at our different agencies and institutions, and there's so much to gain by putting, you know, that expertise and that experience together. And if we don't do that, we're going to be very limited.
Great, thanks. Tom, would you like to add a point of proudness to you?
Yep, you all just heard what we research, and the proud thing is I just got back from doing my best friend's best man speech, so go easy on me in the questions. That's about it.
Okay, so now we really want to open this up to the audience, but I'm very aware that the questions being asked by an audience are dominated by men with beards over a certain age. So I'd first like to open up the questions only to the female members of the audience. Katie.
Hi, thank you to the two people who spoke today. It's been really interesting. My name's Katie Horgan. I'm at the University of Zurich. I think a lot of what we've heard today is around what we need to do for the planet, what we need to do in terms of restoration. I'd like to hear your thoughts about considering tree planting, restoration, activities that allow people to engage with their landscapes. I'd like to hear your thoughts about actually nature and the planet giving back to society. Not giving back, that's the wrong way to put it, but actually as a form of empowerment for people. So it's kind of a reverse. It's not us trying to do good for the planet, it's us being able to interact and empowering people, bearing in mind a large number of the population don't live in the countryside, they live in cities, for example. So things like tree planting, that's not just about planting a forest. There's a lot more involved in doing that.
Do you want to take that first? Yeah.
Sure. There's so many ways that people can become involved, and there are many ways people are already involved, and in some cases their efforts are actually being blocked by government policies. So the first thing I think is to address this issue of where there are already initiatives happening at the grassroots level within communities, and how those can be facilitated more. When the will is already there, and in many cases the knowledge is already there, but it doesn't conform to what the government thinks should be happening there. So I think that's actually happening more often than we know. So that's one thing. The other thing is that there are many, many ways other than tree planting where people can become involved, and they should be involved in the very basic stages of forest landscape restoration in terms of convening community groups, church groups, school children, all kinds of community organizations, institutions that are based within the landscape to make those important decisions about where to restore, how to restore, and what are the important priorities that they have. And all too often, these things are often sort of filtering down from some high-level mandate, and there isn't enough of an opportunity for those local people to become involved. But they have a huge amount to contribute, and in some cases, they already have capacity. In other cases, they need development of their capacity. And I think, unfortunately, the ways of training, like within the forestry sector and the agriculture sector, haven't been oriented enough toward empowering the communities. And I think that there's a huge need to shift the way those extension agencies are working to really promote the restoration instead of to keep promoting the age-old practices that have been led to the degradation we see now.
Doug, you want to?
Yeah, I would agree, I think, with all of what Robin just said. But I think there's, okay, when we engage in restoration activities, I think for the most part, we're talking about working in rural areas with rural communities across the globe. And I think there's a lot more know-how and knowledge at community level than we sort of give credit for. We, as sort of external agencies that come in with new projects and with the best of intentions, try to help without giving enough credit or without trying to understand well enough what that knowledge is, why there's certain behavior at local level that may seem like it's out of sync with a more ecological approach in terms of really trying to use nature and what it can offer as a support. There are reasons why people degrade their environments that have nothing to do with a lack of, with ignorance or a lack of knowledge about how humans and nature interact in a lot of communities. And so we need to understand what those drivers are better. I think we need to really try to tap into historically why things were the way they were when they were working more effectively. And that takes time. That takes building into projects a component of really trying to understand what's on the ground before coming in with, you know, what we think are the best solutions. And part of the problem is that donor expectations and project cycles are such that we have very little time to deliver the results that are expected. You know, most projects are working on a 4 or 5 year time frame. And by the time you get a project up and running, you're almost a year into the project cycle. Results have to be, you know, proven in a very short period of time. And so we take shortcuts because we have to take shortcuts. And that does absolutely no good in terms of really getting processes in place. And I think it's really all about processes. If we can really start to try to help empower those communities, but in ways where what they know or the things that need to be worked on can be given the time for that to happen. And that's a real sort of a systemic problem we have with the way we go about development assistance today. And I'm not sure that awareness is really sinking in fast enough to the funding sources and the donors that are really supporting that.
Yeah, Manuel.
Yeah. You obviously can empower local communities who are, you know, have a stake in what, you know, they want to do if they have, you know, the willingness to do it, if they have a stake and of course an interest, they will either plant trees or let natural regeneration happen. But to me, one way of empowering, which I see globally as a huge need and a big gap, it's on the training of professionals. If we have a new paradigm, well, not necessarily new, but, you know, a relatively new way of managing the landscape, which is forest landscape restoration, which is more than planting trees, which is in essence is a land use planning exercise with local involvement as well as, you know, some top-down involvement. If we admit that, you know, that's going to be our guiding tool or a guiding framework, there's a huge capacity building need. People really they're not being trained to think holistically. And we just finished a global survey on extracurricular training. And we called it extracurricular training on FLR. Okay, so we assumed that it was that, you know, we wanted to know the extent to which FLR principles or approaches were being taught. And we did a very rigorous analysis with very, you know, strict criteria, and we ended up with, since 2006, about 45 online courses that we screened, and we were sure that we could get some patterns. And surprisingly, or probably not surprisingly, they were very silo-oriented. Okay? Issues of project management, you know, stakeholder involvement, landscape ecology, succession were not covered. It was pretty much, it was very technical. So And what you see, what we found is that right after the Bond Challenge was born, which was in 2011, all those courses really mushroomed everywhere. Very short duration, a one-time event, and that's not going to really upscale anything. So on the one hand, the curricular component was very very isolated and probably very narrow. And on the other hand, of short duration, with the exception of one example that was mentioned this morning. It's Yale University's LT program, which is really making a difference, but that's pretty much the exception rather than the rule. And from more of a professional standpoint, what I've seen when these national restoration plans are being drafted, again, is the silo issue, but you see a notable lack of how do you need to understand the landscape in order to really take action. And then you rely on very top-down tools like Rome, nothing wrong with that, but it's, there's a stage, there's an incubation phase that it really needs to really penetrate the system. And it's pretty much the case with RED. RED was dropped like a hot potato in 2005. And a year after, national agencies, everybody had to stop deforestation. How do we do it? Well, it's still a research topic. So the issue is that when these, very global, aspirations come about, which are, very genuine, there's a huge gap that it tends to happen every time a new fad comes. And RED, people are really trying, there's a real movement against RED in terms of an implementation tool. It's not working. And there are scientific results that show that it hasn't stopped deforestation. But that we're talking about, 10, 12 years? And you see people on the ground, forestry professionals, that do really not know how to design a RED project. So the capacity building layer at the professional level, and probably at mid-career people, it's a real need in terms of empowering, and that applies to pretty much every top-down initiative that comes from every 5 or 10 years.
Thanks, Manuel. We're going to move on to another question, I think, Tom, unless you've got some. Do you want to add something short? No?
Sure. I think I would just, I've got a lot less experience, but I would agree entirely. I think bottom-up is the only way anything's going to happen. I don't personally, from my limited experience, believe a top-down approach is the way we're going to restore the world's forests. And from my limited experience, I think the people who are, I really think that we should be targeting the end result of our science should be inspiring people, not finding out more. I'm interested in science because I want to find out more about ecosystems, but the only way things change are by the public, people getting engaged. And I can't believe how simple things like addressing basic topics and communicating it in a simple way on things like social media I'm constantly, since we've started doing a lot of social communications and all this stuff, getting a flood of emails from people who desperately want to give money to environmental charities, who want to plant trees, and it's so, people just have no idea about how to get engaged from my perspective, and I think there's a movement of people who are really keen to. I think as scientists or communicators, it's our role to just show them how simple it is, how enjoyable and encouraging it is to get involved. That's what I would say.
So, more questions from the female members of the audience. Yes. At the back, in the black top. Yeah.
All right, so I have another personal question, but I think other people find it interesting. I'm just curious about pairing sustainable development goals with restoration. Maybe that comes in more tomorrow. But I'm trying to move my research more in that direction, and I see a lot of grants about it, and I just wondered if you guys have any insights or examples of successful projects where that actually works, and where they're explicitly paired, because we hear all the time about how we need really holistic, interdisciplinary restoration efforts that work for everybody, but I'm still searching for examples where it really, really works that way.
Doug, do you want to go first?
One of the things that we're involved in right now at FAO, and we're not alone, I think other restoration partners are doing this as well, is looking at which SDGs, which Sustainable Development Goals does restoration contribute to? And goal 15.3 in particular is kind of the main one that's pointed out. Life on land, this is the obvious one. But we look at restoration as an entry point. It's a means to multiple ends. And so we're trying to make the case that restoration can support a whole variety, most of the Sustainable Development Goals in one way or another, often in indirect ways, but that if restoration is successful, if the productivity of landscapes for crop, livestock, forest-related activities, if that productivity is increased, and if people are able to improve their lot in life and their livelihoods as a result of having a more sustainable ecosystem to support their lives, then they're going to benefit in multiple ways. And those ways hit on education, they hit on health, they hit on water, they hit on many, many different SDGs. And so I think one of the challenges we have is how do we make the case that restoration is good in a way that convinces the non-restoration sort of oriented communities, right? The people and the institutions that are not the restoration groupies, that are not naturally inclined because this is part of what they do. But how do we convince them that restoration is a good thing and it's in their interest and they should support it because it will help them achieve their goals? So I think how we define that narrative and in different ways for different stakeholder groups is going to be really important, because then we can start to mainstream restoration, I think, in a whole lot of different settings and contexts that will benefit in one way or another a much wider audience than sort of the ones who tend to be focused anyway on this restoration work. So what we call it is important. We had a little bit of discussion this morning about, you know, do we still call it restoration? Is that the best thing? And I think given the global movement that exists today and that has really translated into many decentralized levels through the regional initiatives that are up and running now, we should stick with the terminology, but we should find ways to tell the story that resonates with those fora and those stakeholder groups and those institutions that wouldn't normally sort of think, oh yeah, restoration is obviously a good thing. So I think we need to tell that narrative in different ways. And if we can do that, we can start to build up the support and, you know, get, I think, support and funding eventually from some of those sectors that wouldn't normally be on board for restoration. And that sort of relates to what I was saying earlier. We need to break down those silos, because if we look at the landscape and if we look at everything that's in that landscape, it goes way beyond forests and trees in many cases. And at FAO, we're very careful about, when we talk about FLR, we call it forest and landscape restoration. The "and" is very important for us, because we don't want to get locked into a forest sector alone sort of identity. And a lot of our constituents are farmers. They're people that are, you know, working and living on farms, growing crops, raising animals, and forests may not be at all part of their life. There may be trees on their farms, but we're trying to promote ways and approaches that in many cases will involve trees and shrubs, but not necessarily. And that's okay. There's restoration that will not involve perhaps a woody plant. And that's, you know, that's fair game. So we want to try to be as inclusive as possible. And you know, it's a debate within even the global partnership, whether we use the "and" or not, because historically it was forest landscape restoration, but that does lock it into a sector that we feel it needs to go beyond.
Anybody else? You're not obliged to respond if you feel it's been covered adequately. I don't know if anyone wants to.
That covers everything.
No. Okay, good. So I think there was two more. Gabby, there was a question there. Right?
Yeah, so it has been a really interesting afternoon, but actually I have like a more specific question, because we've not delved in a more specific sphere, but more in general of restoration. But I think like Douglas made a good point about farmers, no? So what could be the role of NTFPs in restoration, and how important can this be to link it to livelihoods and sustainable development in terms of restoration?
The role of
Role of NTFPs in restoration. Yeah,
Non-timber forest products.
in relation to agriculture. Manuel, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's an integral part of forest landscape restoration or forest and landscape restoration. I mean, you don't necessarily have to plant trees or necessarily have to let succession proceed. You can do both, and there's probably more NTFPs in naturally regenerating forests than in a plantation, broadly speaking. Or if you accept the view of managing the landscape and not necessarily covering it with trees, you may include NTFPs as part of your land use planning exercise. So they have a very clear role, and they can even be there naturally, or else you can manage them through agroforestry or plantations that offer an NTFP directly. A pine plantation is usually used for edible mushrooms, for example, and you can have your resin and your mushrooms. So it's part of the equation, definitely.
Yeah, I would just like to add that I think there's a huge potential for using natural regeneration for NFTPs, but also, or non-NTFPs, but also enrichment planting and even doing some cultivation within secondary forests to enhance the value for local people. So that can also apply to some of the ecological plantations as well, that the understory can be enriched with medicinal species or vines or mushrooms and fiber species, all kinds of useful species, and firewood harvesting as well can be done sustainably. But there's remarkably little data out there. Manuel knows this well because he and I are in a team trying to do a review of the products and services from different types of reforestation pathways, and there's remarkably little comparative data out there. But there's a lot of perceptions and a lot of anecdotal information. But we really need to have much better information base on this in order to motivate different kinds of practices.
Okay. Doug?
Yeah, I would add that, I mean, I think the potential value of non-wood or non-timber forest products is huge. And in some societies, it's incredibly important for the livelihoods, either in terms of food security because of what comes out, and bushmeat in many African contexts and others is extremely important for food security, but mushrooms, many other things that come from the forest, from the natural forest in particular, are extremely important. And I think there's really untapped potential to also develop value chains, sustainable value chains that are going to make those non-wood, non-timber forest products not only of direct benefit to those people who are living in and around the forest, but to help provide the livelihoods and allow them to generate income that will be an incentive and a motivator to also protect the forest. So I think the more people are benefiting in direct ways from what the forest has to offer, the higher the incentive to protect that forest and use it in a sustainable way. So developing those value chains, there's probably a lot of scope to move in that direction as part of forest conservation efforts.
And I would just throw in that, like ecotourism and recreation are also non-timber forest products that are can be really incentivizing to farmers and people in rural areas. I know there's several network projects in Costa Rica where they're working with farmers along networks to restore ecological networks of forests that allow jaguars to move through and stuff like this. I think that kind of restoration is certainly the best, most valuable thing we can do.
Okay, we have 15 minutes left. I see there are several female members of the audience, so we'll take some of those first, and then we'll open after the next one too. So I think but
So
we've been talking a lot this afternoon about reaching out to communities and kind of adjusting our science to communities and feeding back. And I find this quite hard to achieve on a practical level, and I was wondering if you have any tips, each of you, on how to actually achieve this, so how to adjust our science to community needs or to the needs of the public, or should we be doing that?
Can I ask everyone to try and keep their answers a little bit shorter as well, because we'd like to get through more questions and we've only got 15 minutes left. So, Tom, you seem keen to grab the mic.
I'll take the first one. Yeah, I think scientists need to target really much more effectively the end goal, the target audience. If we're interested in helping somebody in Finland manage a stand, then, you know, make sure we're addressing the exact precise questions that they're aiming for. If we're interested in inspiring society, make sure we're generating basic information that can capture their imagination. I think science is so far down a rabbit hole. I don't know. My own perspective is that in science, there's you sort of get better as you get into more detail, and projects get better and better and better, and then after a point, no analysis is ever complete, and you start getting deeper and deeper down rabbit holes, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And the good scientist is just someone who finds somewhere around that peak where it's most effective without wasting the most amount of time. And I think as a scientific community, we are way over here in terms of communicating our science. We don't even no one ever targets their science at what people are interested in. We generally targeting it as, can this theory get me into ecology letters? Like we need to be aiming it at what the people are interested in, not in what feels safest for us based on the scientists around us.
Yeah, I think to me it gets back a little bit to a point that somebody raised earlier today about frustration working in academia, that there tend to be too many silos as well. And I think, you know, there are academics and researchers who are working in local communities to understand, you know, community dynamics, anthropologists, sociologists. So trying to break down those walls in academia and partner more with some of the people doing scientific research that may seem like it's very divorced from restoration and ecological aspects is something that probably could help. And then, you know, developing scientific teams that are really looking at a much more broad-based array of issues that are probably all going to be important if this restoration work is ultimately going to be successful. I mean, it's easier said than done, but I think having that discussion, and it would be interesting to know in this setting how many disciplines are actually represented even from ETH. You know, hopefully, hopefully quite a few.
Should we do a quick panel? Who would classify themselves as a scientist in this room? Okay, so the vast majority. Okay, who would classify themselves as a what did you was the?
Well, no, I mean not just a scientist, but what kind of a scientist? You know, are you on the biophysical side? Are you on the socioeconomic side? Are you on the behavioral side? I mean, that's to me the crux of it is there are many scientists, but are those scientists talking to one another across disciplines?
Okay, go on, Manuel. Yeah.
Yeah. I was trained as a scientist, and I still do research. Now it's more analytical than empirical, but to give you a clear example, we put out a report in Peru, which is the country where I'm based and work the most, that really looked at how feasible it was for the country to achieve their restoration commitments. When they said they would going to restore 3.2 million hectares, the government said, we're going to do it via commercial plantations. And probably 6-8 months after that, it occurred to me that there hadn't been any report or serious study looking at the feasibility of that. And we put out a report that took about 1.5 years to develop. And we presented that to the national government. And it was a reality check. There was no way that they could achieve that, not even in 2050, because of the biophysical conditions, land tenure issues, silvicultural considerations, roads, et cetera, et cetera. underdeveloped industries. So that's science. I mean, it was a rigorous exercise. So what I'm trying to say is that in our case, or at least in the organization where I work, we always look at an entry point in which we can influence thinking and with sound evidence. And in this case, and I repeat again what I said at the introduction, that's pretty much our role at CIFOR, is to really influence policy and practice through sound research. It can be empirical or analytical. We tend to go more towards the analytical comparative approach, but in the context of scaling up restoration, those kinds of exercises are much needed, because every country is pretty much taking its own direction, which is it's okay. But if we really want to scale up, we need a little bit of a concerted effort in developing, scientific or analytical interventions to really influence new thinking and really upscale these efforts.
Okay. So. Yes, here, sorry, just so I can remember. You, and then we'll open to everyone.
Hi, I'm Maria from the University of Bern, Maria Felipe Lucia. So my question is a bit related to what we have discussed before over there. And it's like, well, this morning we have been, and also during the afternoon, we have been talking about different targets for restoration. And it's like most of the times when we target restoration, it's like for climate effect or for water scarcity, but sometimes also these non-forest, not timber products. But I wonder if we can also, when we try to scale up this restoration, we can focus on multiple ecosystem functions, multiple services at the same time. And how can we do that? And a bit related also to some of the talk this morning, that probably will lead us to some trade-offs between different functions or different services. And then the question is, how can we then deal with this? How do we make these decisions? And where do we favorize particular function or services? And where do we promote these others?
Robin, you're going to go?
There are some approaches that are being used now specifically to, I don't want to use the word optimize, but to do a better job of prioritizing and understanding where we can synergize, where there can be win-win types of situations, or at least do our best at maximizing multiple outcomes of restoration. And the techniques that are used are really borrowed from the conservation field that involve multiple factors and a spatial prioritization approaches. And they're now starting to be applied in many cases at the regional scale, national scale, and a few at the more landscape scale. But for example, this is being done within the Atlantic forest now to show where we can get the best returns for biodiversity, carbon, and water for the minimal amount of cost.
I wanted to make the point, like, yeah, sometimes we just talk about these kind of three key services, like water, diversity, and carbon, but can we work with more, like with kind of 5, 6, 10? That's at that level, that multiple ecosystem services that I'm talking about when we talk about multifunctional forests, for example. Like, it's usually more than these three key typical ones, but we can think also about how do we restore nutrient cycling, how we restore, I don't know, temperature regulation, or all these cultural services at the same time. And yeah.
Well, I think the best approach is to allow natural regeneration. You're going to get the best bargain for that. And I think you can also enrich forests if they're missing certain elements that are important to the community or to the regional biota. So starting from a more natural system, you're more likely to get the most services from that.
Short response, Doug?
Yeah, I would just say it's also a question of, who's involved in the discussion. You need to find out who are the people, the communities that are going to be affected directly by whatever the restoration effort will be about, and find out, what are their needs, because unless you figure that out and get a buy-in, you can talk about all of the wonderful ecosystem services that different restoration activities can offer. But if people don't own that and believe in it and feel that it's in their interest, they're not going to do it, or they're going to sabotage perhaps what you're promoting. So, you know, it starts out, I think, from a very basic level with a multi-stakeholder approach, listening to local people, listening to local officials, listening to national. Everybody's got a stake in that landscape, has to somehow be heard. And all of that has to be put together. And that's easier said than done. But that process is really crucial to understanding what the benefits and opportunities are, and then figuring out what makes sense and what's feasible. And it may be a stepwise process, but I think it all has to be put on the table initially, and you have to have the know-how coming in that understands what the different services and goods and benefits can come out of these activities. And it may, in some cases, have little to do with restoration, you know, but that might be part of the solution. So it has to be, I think, a broader approach and multi-stakeholder.
Hold you, go on very briefly.
Yeah, very quickly. To follow up, CIFOR is doing research at the moment on which kind of stakeholder, multi-stakeholder platforms and fora work better than others. So this is, you know, very applied, and we're looking at 6 different countries at the national and subnational level. So it's, you know, it's research, but it's going to inform not only restoration, but many other, you know, RED, for example, and you know, and community planning. So that hasn't been done so far. You know, which model works best under which circumstances. So stay tuned. In 1 year, we'll have the results.
Okay, thanks, Manuel. So this question here.
I have questions about the global partnership on FLR and cross-sector collaboration in general. What are the incentives and strategies that you've identified that are best to engage partners on, to collaborate on scaling up forest restoration? And what is the level of cross-sector collaboration you think you've achieved, and are you satisfied with the outcomes? What improvement do you foresee, or would you like to see?
I think that's for you, Doug.
Yeah, I think the global partnership on FLR, on forest and landscape restoration, is evolving. It's growing. It's bringing in new members, but they're sort of defining what those criteria would be to bring in new membership. A lot of it's kind of the who's who, the institutions that have been involved for many, many years in this work. I think, as I was sort of alluding to before, there's a new sort of attitude, I think, that we shouldn't be competing against one another, even though that's still a reality in terms of how we fund our work to a large extent. But there's more to gain by putting ourselves together. And that's even being, there's an example I can give where the German government, Ministry of Environment, BMU, has this international climate initiative, which somebody spoke about earlier today. And they're putting a lot of money into Africa now, restoration, the AFR 100 initiative in Africa. And they've basically asked a number of institutions, 6 or 7, to put themselves together to put together a proposal for a major program in Africa. That's being driven by the donor, and it's very important. So I think we have some good examples now. Tomorrow I'll be making a presentation and talk a little bit about one of the programs we have that we're doing jointly with IUCN and UNEP, UN Environment. So we're moving in that direction, and I think we all understand that there's more to gain. So there's a long ways to go. That's not so much cross-sectoral or multi-sectoral. It's looking at different institutions, because of a lot of our institutions work on similar issues and have similar areas of expertise. But I think they're trying to strive to get a broader representation in this global partnership so that different interests are there, including things like private sector interests, which up until now haven't really been represented. So impact fund representatives, even pure private sector companies that are going to be major players probably in restoration need to be part of that dialogue, and they're starting to come into that. So good strides are being made in that direction, I would say.
So I'm going to open it to all the audience now. Except Claude. No, come on. Go on.
Just on what you were saying, one of the things that we've learned is that dialogues can, in the best situations, create convergence, and then we all agree, and then we get things done. But dialogues can also create divergence. So it's not enough to sit the right people at the right table. It's not enough to bring all the stakeholders and to give them all the voice. The way the discussion is carried, the method that is used to get to an agreement makes it or breaks it. So I wonder if you have something to say on that. And it links also to Manuel, what you're saying. What are the platforms that are working? Are you looking at the platforms, or are you looking at what they are doing to make it work?
Basically at the mechanism they use. Yeah. But if we take the, again, the FLR paradigm, let's call it that way. I mean, it's embedded into the landscape approach, right? The landscape approach has a few principles, that have been more or less agreed by the scientific community. They can be put to a test, obviously. But the landscape approach, in essence, is a negotiation platform. It's that at the heart of the landscape approach is to come with a negotiated solution about, a given environmental problem or socio-ecological problem. And most people do not see it that way. And that's why I personally think that the implementation of the landscape approach is in itself difficult, but it needs to be tried in a systematic way and in a comparative way. Otherwise, we'll never learn. And that's why that, one of the reasons it motivated us to really look at these multi-stakeholder platforms in the context of RED at the subnational level. But it goes back again to the training phase. I mean, we need, professionals that can really understand how to implement the basics of a landscape approach for a given environmental problem, and in this case, forest restoration.
Fidel.
Hello. Thank you, everyone, for your talks. I'm Fidel, PhD student here at the ETH. So I'm working in the Peruvian Amazon with a big tree called Brazil Nuts. It's also an NTFP. And our project is going towards forest enrichment and large-scale planting of Brazil nuts. And I'm thinking about a research partner there in Peru. Previously, they had reforestation projects in which they just delivered thousands of seedlings. And now that we're going there to the same places, we see that those seedlings never were planted. So I'm thinking about monitoring, how much, I haven't really seen so much efforts and sort of investment in monitoring afterwards, not focusing on natural regeneration, but just planting itself. Isn't it better to just decrease a little bit of the investment of the numbers of seedlings to be planted and follow up in the monitoring and sort of, give a strength into the actual plantations more than just planting out? And then after many years realizing that nothing really happened and the seedlings are never in the field.
Yes. I completely agree. Yeah, from my experience working with organizations like Plant for the Planet, they work with lots of people who are doing different restoration efforts, and some of them just get $1 million and they plant 1 million trees and they're done, and then they die next year, and it was the biggest waste of time. In fact, they can damage the ecosystem, as various people have shown. Yeah, I think they're finding now that more than half of their money for each project is ending up being allocated to monitoring systems down the line. Up to 3 years, it seems essential to be monitoring restoration. But again, the argument is that this tree planting should only be supplementing the natural generation and hopefully speeding up the natural regeneration. So it's a process of, it shouldn't all be about planting trees and spending money on planting trees. I completely agree.
Okay.
I would back up another step and understand why were those trees not planted in the first place. I mean, the monitoring is important, but probably somebody went in and said, we've got 1,000 trees to plant, let's just mobilize everybody and do it. Which in the short run probably might work. In this case, it didn't work, but I think it's like, unless people understand why they're being asked to do something and they buy into that, when you look at survival rates in so many projects of tree planting, it's abominable in so many situations. And we checked the sheet, how many, the results are that we're evaluated on is how many seedlings did we plant. You know, does anybody go back 5 years, 10 years later and look at the survival and use that as a sort of a criterion for, you know, do we continue along this pathway? So I think there's a danger in these campaigns that are just looking at numbers, you know, whether it's number of hectares to be restored, whether it's number of seedlings to be planted, you know, that's part of the solution possibly, but unless you figure out what the problems are and get those stakeholders involved in buying into that, you're probably going to have problems in the long run.
Okay, we're going to have one more question. Yes.
Thank you very much for the many contributions, very interesting. I have a question to follow up on this last point. I work often with many NGOs which are doing reforestation or renaturation, regeneration projects, but from the outside view. And one of the key drivers here seems to be the short-term nature of funding and of the project length. Many donors recognize that, can you hear me? Well, many donors recognize that monitoring, impact assessment, proper impact assessment is crucial. Methodologies are being discussed, but in the end, things take a time span of 2-3 years and they're dropped off. Move on to the next one. And my question would be directed particularly to the FAO side, since you mentioned also the connection with the private entities. Which lines do you think are potentially fruitful in creating long-term incentives or incentives for long-term engagement for the NGOs as operative partners in some projects, but also for the private sector when they have to comply or move in a certain direction, be it for sourcing, responsible sourcing, for supply chain management, or for stakeholder, you know, community engagement when they have some CSR, sustainability engagement. What's your perspective? I mean, which type of mechanisms, drivers could potentially be put in place?
Well, I think the more we can embed restoration in economically viable contexts and activities, the better off we're going to be. And so the role of private sector I see as I mean, it hasn't even been tapped, but it's going to be a major, major driver of restoration globally. And it's not necessarily private sector along the lines that we tend to think of companies coming in, whether they're plantation companies or whatever. Private sector is going to be, I think, very effective at the almost the lowest level. When local communities increase their entrepreneurial skills and learn better how to do basic accounting and to be able to engage in livelihood activities where these are going to be micro enterprises, small scale enterprises, that's where we're going to see the incentives there. We're going to see people engaging because they see a direct benefit. And there's no reason why we can't start to devise more and more restoration activities that I think have that aspect, that have the potential to be livelihood drivers for local communities. So, you know, and this is going to happen at many different levels, I think, but this is, you know, this goes beyond the technical approach that we're taking today. It's building the capacity of local communities to do things that may relate to restoration. They may relate to many other things that are going to be part of their livelihood development. And then I think if we develop those capacities at local level and those skills so that people can become entrepreneurs and successful business people, then you're going to encourage investment coming in. You're going to get the impact investors and the other private sector investors to come in because there's going to be money to be made. It's not only about money, but that is going to be a key motivation for many, many, I think, stakeholders to get more engaged and in a long-term way and to do things that are going to be sustainable because they see it's in their own interest to do so. So I think it's highly neglected so far, the aspect of how do we really develop a private sector models that are going to be a big part of the restoration movement in the future. We haven't really gone there, and we haven't included the people who are coming from that sector in the dialogue adequately up until now. But the potential is huge.
Okay, so just a quick poll. Could you please put your hand up if you classify yourself as a social scientist? 1, 2, 3. So probably 10% of the audience. And hand up if you classify yourself as a biophysical scientist. So there's a different category, a third category. Put yourself hand up if you're an interdisciplinary scientist. Very good. I think that reflects very well the topics of discussion today, given that this was a natural science focus of today, and I think it's very evident that the focus has been very interdisciplinary in it, which I think is very optimistic in terms of addressing the challenges of rising up to scaling of forest restoration. I also would like to add that I think the organising committee did an excellent job in selecting their panel. They clearly were a brilliant contribution. So I think we should all thank both, not only the panel, but the speakers for today, but also the audience for some fantastic questions.